Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that will set the scene for you for the Potsdam and Yalta conferences, but particularly the Potsdam Conference. Because in this presentation, looking at the causes of the Cold War, I'm going to focus on the mistrust that developed before Potsdam. From the West's perspective, when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, with World War I still raging, they not only took control of the government, but they murdered the Russian royal family. They ended the war with Germany, breaking their alliance with Britain and France in the process. They refused to pay back any loans France and other countries had made to the old government, and the state took control of all businesses, including foreign-owned businesses. As for the Bolshevik perspective, with World War I over, Western powers responded by intervening on the side of the whites in the Russian Civil War of 1918 through to 1920, with American, British and French troops all involved, even if only half-heartedly and in small numbers. And they were treated as pariahs. The Soviet Union was not invited to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, at which Russian land was given to Poland, and Finland, as well as the Baltic states, had their independence recognised. Nor was it invited to join the League of Nations at the beginning of 1920. Then, in the years before the outbreak of World War II, the Soviet Union was frustrated by the British and French appeasement of Hitler, a frustration that led to mistrust. Its overtures for an anti-fascist alliance during the Spanish Civil War were ignored, and it wasn't invited to the Munich Peace Conference that decided the fate of Czechoslovakia, even though, like the French, it had an alliance with the Czechs. From the West's perspective, they were shocked by the Nazi-Soviet pact and this secret agreement to partition Poland between them. The West was also shocked to learn of the mass murder of 4,500 captured Polish officers by the Red Army in the forests of Katyn, just outside Smolensk, with around 4 times that number of civilians killed too, in different places. It was clearly an attempt by the Soviet Union to destroy the Polish leadership following the partition of the country, and it was revealed by the Germans in order to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union after their invasion of Russia. The Soviet Union only joined the fight against Nazi Germany after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. To return to the Soviet Union's perspective, with both sides fighting Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union was frustrated with the West's delay in invading France and opening a second front. D-Day was not until June 1944, when the Soviet Union had been invaded in June 1941. The Russians had been fighting the Germans virtually alone since 1941, and they were desperate for help, and it left them suspicious that the West wanted them to be badly damaged. And to return to the West's perspective, while pushing the German army back and with the war coming to its end, the Red Army allegedly delayed its attack on Warsaw until the uprising of Poles had been crushed by the Germans. Again, this was seen as a means of getting rid of potential leaders, this time in post-war Poland. Evidence that even before the war was over, the Soviet Union was making plans for the post-war order. In addition to all the above, we need to understand the Soviet Union's perspective in the light of not one, not two, but 3 invasions, each at a terrible price. I put them in reverse order on the slide, but first there was Napoleon's march on Moscow in the early 19th century. Then the Kaiser's German army invaded in World War I at a terrible loss of life. 1,700,000 soldiers and between 400,000 and 750,000 civilians. Whilst the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, forced on Russia by Germany, took a huge amount of territory and exacted massive reparation payments from the Russians. Then there was the invasion by Hitler's forces. The number of lives lost vary wildly, but World War II may have cost the Soviet Union as many as 36 million lives, 25 million civilians, not far off 20% of its pre-war population, something approximate to 40 times that of British and American losses in Europe combined, and almost half of total deaths in the war. More conservative estimates put the figure lower, at 20 million lives lost, but that's still an enormous figure. There were more than 10 million refugees too. As for the destruction, 70,000 villages, 100,000 state farms, 25 million homes, 84,000 schools, maybe not such a loss in your eyes, 31,000 factories, 65,000 kilometres of railway track, and much, much more. Hence, the need on the part of the Soviet Union for security and a buffer zone that would require any future invader to penetrate Soviet-controlled Poland and other countries before ever reaching Russian soil. Hence, too, the Soviet Union's wish to have Germany crippled and forced to pay heavy reparations, as had France after World War I, after its second invasion by German troops. So there was enough cause on both sides for mistrust, and so misunderstandings. Enough to sink a battleship, as we used to say. And this must be borne in mind as you look at what happened at Potsdam, at Yalta, and beyond. And of course, the blame game has already begun. I still think the Cold War was above all else an ideological war. But there is a lot more than the ideological differences when it comes to explaining why the belated anti-fascist alliance collapsed so quickly. This, of course, is context, and if you've been listening to my presentations for long, you will know I place great emphasis on the importance of context. But for this presentation, it only remains for me to thank you for listening. But before I go, let me tell you about my podcast. It's called Making Sense of This Crazy World. And as I say each week in introducing an episode, my aim is to use history to help explain the crazy world we live in today. It's been running for a year now, so there are plenty of mini-series that might pique your interest. Check it out, if you're not approaching the dreaded exam season, that is. If you're interested in history, you should find it interesting too. But that's it for me for now. Cheers.